I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Christopher Wylie.
Hi.
Hi, Chris. The Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. I'm not going to go through his biography. You can read it in the programme, because what we want to do is to cover as much ground together as we can and open up the floor for questions as soon as we've got through our initial conversation. So, Chris, your story and the Cambridge Analytica story has been very well covered in The Guardian and other newspapers by Carol Cadwallader, who won the Orwell Prize.
Because
just a quick shout out. Yeah, congratulations to Carol for that. But I suppose one of the things to start with is, the whole thing of disinformation is not new. Manipulation, people in pursuit of power do things, manipulate the truth, try to manipulate people. So can you just very briefly tell us what's different about today's environment that makes that manipulation so much more effective and difficult to identify?
Yeah, so when you think about like politics in general, because I hear this a lot, well, politicians lie all the time, so disinformation is just like, part of politics. But the real difference is that when you think about how politicians and candidates or other actors come out and speak in a public forum, traditionally it's you go into a public forum, you go into the public square, you say something that may or may not be true, but there's a common experience amongst the audience, right? And so that audience might be, your community members, it might be civil society, it might be journalists, it might be opposition candidates, and everybody hears the same thing, and if you fib, if you lie, if you whatever, somebody's there to call you out. The difference is that when you have an online environment, rather than me standing on my soapbox and telling you whatever it is that I want to tell you, I can go to each and every one of you and whisper in your ear. And I can whisper in your ear with the benefit of having followed you around for weeks on end, knowing exactly how you live, what you like, what you want to hear. And in addition to that, I can whisper in your ear, knowing everything about you, and I'm invisible. Because other people don't necessarily see that I am talking to you or that I'm not talking to you. They don't hear what I'm saying to you. And all of a sudden, that's how you can create these very sort of segmented or fractured, sort of cognitive monocultures that exist online, is because there is no transparency. And it's that environment that acts as an accelerant for disinformation, because there's no checks and balances to it that we have traditionally in elections of yesterday.
So it's really the data, how much data is known about people. And in a way, I think there's some people don't like the concept of targeted advertising during elections. I don't think you're one of them, are you? You would support the idea of targeted messaging, not necessarily advertising.
Yeah, so there's a big difference between targeting and disinformation, right? Targeting is knowing something about a group of people and trying to convey the most relevant information to those people. No one likes spam. Like, no one likes random ads that just have nothing to do with them. If you're online and you're sitting here in the UK, you probably don't want ads for, I don't know, some kind of Korean thing, because you're not there. Like, so relevance is important to people, and also when you look at, there are many really positive uses of targeting. I've worked on projects where we go and try to motivate traditionally disenfranchised groups of people to go and vote or register to vote. Often single women, working women, people of color, people who are systemically disenfranchised in society often need that extra push in order to go out and register to vote or participate. That's a really positive and I think healthy use of targeting to find things that are most relevant to people. The difference is that there's a line that you have to draw between relevance and coercion and manipulation. And that's a line, sometimes it's a gray area, but there's a line that really does distinguish the two. If you are targeting people with truthful, relevant information, and your intention is to encourage people to participate in society, not to fracture and segment, not to cause distrust amongst people, then I think there is a place for that in our democracy.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot this morning about sort of various aspects of warfare, cyber warfare, and so on. And one of the sort of hidden aspects, if you like, is information as warfare, as a dimension of the battle space.
Yeah.
Do you think that we have the right people in the military to help to combat those sort of disinformation?
Yeah. It's interesting that you said. So in military doctrine, you've got something called the multidimensional battle space. So you've got land, air, sea, space, and then information. So it's often called the fifth dimension of your battle space, and it's actually an incredibly important part of your battle space or any kind of combat situation. Because access to information and denial of information or infiltration of an information sphere affects how the belligerent is going to behave in that battle space. So it's quite relevant for military. But the problem with the military is that people like me can't join, right? I'm not the type of person that they're going to go and recruit.
Would you want to work for the military?
And well, I think that first of all, I think that the military plays a really important role in our common defense, and including our defense of our democracy. Information operations is a key part of that. And as somebody who, as a gay Canadian vegan, I actually really like information operations and a non-kinetic approach to defense. That actually you don't necessarily always have to blow shit up. You can influence people to behave in a way that is safer for your campaign. But I think that the thing that the military kind of misses out is that when you look at a lot of people who work in tech, they're not the kinds of people who are conducive to a military environment, even though they often have really good ideas. Like when I worked at a defense contractor, one of the things that they would say when we had meetings with military is we've got people that you could never have, because they can come in with pink hair and a nose ring and it's fine. So.
And I mean, sort of trying to bring together the Cambridge Analytica story and this sort of sense of information being weaponized against people. How do we make democracies resilient to those sort of attacks? I think a lot's been said about the 2016 elections, but if you're thinking about tomorrow's elections, next year's, the years after, what do we need to do differently to make ourselves, our democracies, more resilient?
I think, first of all, we need to understand that, our elections are no longer purely a domestic affair, that they have an international dimension to it, they have a security dimension to it, and that, when you're looking at platforms like Facebook, it's not just where, you add people who you met at a party 5 years ago, it's actually, it's part of an information battle space. And that that's in part a role for government, for military to take a look at and try to secure those platforms. But also there's a huge amount of responsibility that I think these platforms have that they're shirking away from, which is that they are not disclosing what is going on their platforms. Facebook knows exactly what's happening on its platform. But it is not disclosing huge amounts of information, in part because I think it makes for an uncomfortable conversation about are these platforms creating risks to our democracy. In terms of what we can do about it, demand better enforcement of current laws, but I think we need a new regulatory regime. When we look at every other sector of importance to our society, whether it's food, medicine, roads, buildings, you name it, we've got standards for consumer safety. And the one area where we don't have standards for consumer safety is in software and online platforms. And I think that's something that we seriously need to look at.
But we need the information first, don't we? And that's one of your points,
there's
so much known by and secretive.
Yeah, and here's where you've got a huge risk. Most of these companies are American. Right? So if you're here in Britain and you're asking answers, you are essentially relying on the goodwill of these companies to provide you that information or to respond to your requests or demands. So when you look at, for example, how Parliament has consistently requested Mark Zuckerberg to show up, and he continuously denies to the fact where the parliamentary inquiry is now considering issuing a standing summons on Mark Zuckerberg.
Why do you think he hasn't turned up?
Because he knows that he's going to get asked tough questions. Because unlike a bunch of senators where in DC where you can lobby them and you can finance their campaigns. Here you've got MPs that you haven't developed that kind of relationship with, and actually do their research and care about about what's happening, and are willing to ask really tough questions. And so it's, I think it's telling that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want to show up to the country that has jurisdiction over the investigation into Cambridge Analytica, where a lot of these events happens, where the most amount of knowledge and understanding is here, because there'll be tough questions asked, and sometimes that will create an uncomfortable conversation. But I think we need to have that uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah. And one of the dilemmas, of course, is that if you want to have global impact with any regulation, short of some intergovernmental process that doesn't look like it's happening, the most effective global impact is going to be achieved by having the platforms themselves willingly do something.
Right.
Why won't that work?
Well, because we are relying on platforms that don't really have an incentive to comply with new rules. I mean, they like it just how it is right now. They don't have to follow any rules. There's no sort of standards or expectations of their behavior.
But pushing back a little bit on that, I mean, that we've had the Delete Facebook campaign.
Yeah, which I don't agree with, by the way. I don't think people should delete Facebook, because I think that's just a giant cop-out. It's like saying, oh, you don't want to be electrocuted, stop using electricity. You know what? Guess what? People, tell me, what job can you get now where you refuse to use the internet? You can't. The internet is a utility, and we can't just expect the onus to be on you, the user, to manage what, frankly, is the safety, your own safety. We don't, when we have buildings, we don't say, oh, you know what, it's fine. But if the architect doesn't want to have an emergency exit, we'll let them, and we'll just put some terms and conditions outside that says you might burn alive if there's a fire.
7,000 words.
So I think the problem that I have with Delete Facebook is not necessarily the intention, which is to put pressure on Facebook. I just don't like the fact that it assumes that the onus has to be on you, the user, rather than the platform that is exploiting your information and making money off of it.
Yeah, but regardless of the delete, the Delete Facebook thing, I don't think it's been a particularly comfortable 18 months for Facebook in particular and other social media platforms. So perhaps they have an incentive also to show a sort of, this is what we're doing, and we are hearing about initiatives such as flagging of fake news, or even supporting independent quality journalism, or making people resilient.
When they're not threatening to sue them for something that's true. Let's just be clear about that. Facebook does not work collaboratively with civil society. It does not work collaboratively with journalists. It's ironic that you've got a company that often will reward white hat hackers with bounties for exploiting and exposing security vulnerabilities in their system, but then threaten to sue papers like The Guardian when they do the exact same thing through the vehicle of journalism. Because they don't like that scrutiny. I think it's quite telling.
So
you know what the CTO of Facebook said at Parliament when he was asked about that? He said, "Oh, we just assumed that threatening journalists was just the done thing."
Right. Yes. Well,
in the UK.
In some places, perhaps.
Yeah, Zimbabwe, not here.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that we always do, whether it's a security paradigm or in reacting to any disaster, is we learn from yesterday's problems. But let's have a think about 10 years from now, when we've got a much more sentient environment. A robot might be our boss.
Yeah.
What sort of scope for manipulation of people do you foresee, and how do we make our society a bit more resilient?
Yeah, well, because I think this is something that it's a really important point that you make, is that we can't just think about what has happened or what is currently available in terms of technological capacity and the risks that creates. We have to look at what are the trends moving forward. So when you look at, when I joined Facebook in 2007, they didn't have facial recognition, right? So I put up all of my photos and whatnot, and I clicked the however many thousands of words. Back in comfier times. And so I agree that, okay, information that I put up can be analyzed without thinking that, oh, my photos might be used to create an algorithm that recognizes my facial structure, which then Facebook or other companies can go out onto the internet and track everything else that I'm doing using facial recognition. So that's just one example. It's not, and so at the time it was not expected. And so this is the problem with technology it's what's great about technology, but also what creates a problem is that it evolves so quickly that we can't necessarily always imagine as a user how is this going to be used. But there are trends. So when you look at how people are just starting to put fairly rudimentary AI into their homes with like Alexa, for example, right? It's always listening to you. And then you've got smartphones. You've got potentially later down the road self-driving cars. Your refrigerator will become smart. Everything will become smart and interconnected. Where all of a sudden you've got algorithms that might start influencing the physical space that you are in. When you walk into Starbucks, how much should you pay for that? When you walk into a building, what should be presented to you? How much service should you get? Should you be allowed in? And all of a sudden, you've got algorithms whose only morality is optimizing you, deciding and influencing the physical space around you. And so you translate the information environment down into a physical space as well. And
so
the problem,
how do we get the algorithms to be a bit more ethical?
well, we require the people who make the algorithms to be more ethical. We have codes of practice and ethical standards for doctors, for lawyers, for teachers, for accountants, for you name it, except for data scientists and engineers, software engineers, right? And so, there should be an onus placed on people creating these things to have due consideration to the effects of users and more broadly, the effects on society that you are creating. That yes, you are optimizing this ad really, really well, but is that going to create a risk of Russian disinformation, right? And putting the onus on the people who make it, I think would work wonders, because we can regulate companies all we want, but they've got big legal teams, right? And they'll figure out, the cost-benefit analysis of breaking some kind of regulation, and they'll just go for it, or they'll move jurisdictions or whatever, right? If you put the onus on the actual engineers to say you've got a proactive ethical and legal duty to make sure that you are not harming society with the technologies that you are creating, you need to empower them to be able to say to their manager, no, I can't do that. That would break my code of ethics.
I won't be able to work again.
Yeah. In the same way that
a
lawyer or a doctor can't behave unethically, otherwise they could be disbarred.
I've just got, before I open up to questions, which I'm going to do in a couple of minutes, I can't have you here and not ask you about your experience of being a whistleblower. Every time, we've just had it last week, a huge scandal in in a Gosport hospital of people being overprescribed drugs. And every time one of these horrifying events happens, the sort of policymakers' response, the leaders' response is, hundreds of people must have known. Why didn't anybody say so? So here you've got a room full of those people. Tell them why people don't speak out.
Because it sucks. No, I mean, it's not, I'm lucky in that I had a lot of support. I had a lot of legal support. I had a lot of planning before all of this came out.
Because you were a year as an anonymous source. And at what point had you decided, I'm going to go public?
It's not a single point. I mean, this is sort of a misnomer. It's sort of like boiling a frog. Eventually you just kind of end up coming out. But the thing that I would say is that there's actually almost no support for quote unquote whistleblowers. And one of the problems that I have with the narrative of being a whistleblower is that there's sort of this like concept of the Herculean heroic whistleblower, and it shouldn't require that. It shouldn't require somebody who's willing to just literally blow up their entire life, for social goods. And that they pay all the expense of that. There's no support for legal. And it's not even legal. Like it's like things like, how are you going to get a job after, right?
Well, I think we know
how are you going to pay your rent, right? What about all the people who you've been working with who now all of a sudden see you as, that you've betrayed them in some way, you've ratted them out.
And also the sort of, back to our military recruitment. Pink hair, vegan. Whistleblower. Not good on the CV.
Well, not necessarily. Well, I mean, I think it depends. For me, and I think for a lot of other whistleblowers, it's interesting because when you're a queer person, you often experience coming out all the time, and so for me, this was just like a coming out process again and again and again, and that's why I think you do have a lot of whistleblowers who happen to be queer also. But yeah, I mean, being a whistleblower, often, it's sort of, we celebrate it in theory, but then if you look at it in practice, when you're sitting down and you're the HR person, you go, oh, this person might be a bit problematic. They have this tendency to report things to the police.
Yeah. We don't want that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open up now the floor for questions. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask Christopher Wylie a question. Patricia.
So to get the questions going, thanks, Christopher, so much for coming. And also, so you talk about the onus being on the people who create the software.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the onus on the social media platforms, but what about the onus on those who are requesting the services that Cambridge Analytica provided? What's the politicians, the people who are running the political campaigns, and others who are doing similar things? Where's their social responsibility? Do we just cannot trust these people anymore? Or should we be forcing them to act in a way that is ethical and moral and of some kind of equivalence with the standing that they have in our societies?
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing that I'd say is if you're Steve Bannon and you're creating what, in my view, are highly problematic programs, you see that as ethical and moral. So the first thing that I'd say is that morality is relative. And so oftentimes you do have a lot of, for example, clients of Cambridge Analytica who do see that, the ends justify the means. How do you prevent that? I think that when you look at, there's a couple things. So first, we require transparency in donations and spending, but we don't require transparency in communication. And so what that means is that if you put out an ad online, you don't have to declare it and no one sees it. And so that's what I was saying before. It's like whispering into a group of people's ears where no one knows who's seen or heard what. And that, I think, requiring registration of political communication, where if you are targeting something, you still have to declare it and put it in public on a registry where your opposition can look at it, where journalists can look at it, where civil society can look at it, I think would start to encourage better behavior. I think that when you look at how companies like Cambridge Analytica work, in particular also abroad, you've got a lot of Western clients who use them to interfere in emerging democracies and take advantage of that, often resource-rich countries where there's an incentive to make money. And none of that has to be registered. So for example, in the United States, if you are a foreign agent and you are lobbying or conducting political activity in the United States, you have to register. But if you do the same kind of work and you're an American company or a British company or what have you, and you do work elsewhere, you don't have to register that. And often you're working in countries that don't have very well-developed transparency regulatory mechanisms for that. And so in the same way that we now sort of, with the Bribery Act in the UK or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, sort of create these international legal obligations on British or American actors, I think we also, in the same way, should put obligations on political actors who go around the world in countries that don't necessarily have the capacity to regulate them.
Thank you. Any other questions? Anyone else want? Stacey? If you would like to ask a question, can you just raise your hand so I know who's in the queue? Okay, so we can get the mic sort of into that bank afterwards. Stacey, please go ahead.
Thank you. Stacey from Oxford Information Labs. So I think it's really interesting that you were saying how internet is a utility. I think we would all agree, and asking people to delete Facebook is probably not the right conversation to be having. So my question is, what is that right conversation, or what's being overlooked or not getting enough airtime in this public discourse that we're having at the moment? And do you think this should change, is changing, or should change people's relationship with social media? If not, maybe why?
So I think, in the same way that we require seat belts in cars, or we have building standards for the wiring of your, electricity and whatnot. We should we should be having conversations about what is safe and what is unsafe online, and looking at it through the prism of safety, because misuse of personal data is a safety issue. I mean, it's not just that somebody might look at what your music playlist is and discover to everyone's shock that you listen to Justin Bieber. It's what you can do with that information moving forward, and how you can integrate that information. And if you have malicious intentions, you can use that to manipulate people. And so I think that the conversation really needs to be about what is safe, and look at it through the prism of safety. And how would that change people's relationship with social media? I mean, people have this habit of, there's an expression, what interests the public is not always in the public interest, right? And so people have a tendency to be drawn to, things, information, content that isn't necessarily healthy for society overall. And so I think there needs to be a conversation about how to make sure that that kind of content is safe and it is beneficial, and that also how does this change our relationship with social media? I think that, again, the onus shouldn't be on us, the user, you, the user, people as users, to change their relationship. I think it should start with the platforms. And we can require regulations, we can require standards that then are imparted on those platforms, so that engineering solutions are used, not just terms and conditions, so that platforms are designed in a way that are less addictive or less coercive. But I think it starts. I don't think it starts with users. I honestly don't.
I'm going to take two questions in a row. So there's a gentleman there, James, and then there's a chap there next to you. Yes.
Thank you, Chris. You said that you were entirely happy with targeted advertising, and I think actually one of the confusing things was that people didn't really understand what was going on with targeted advertising until this came out.
Yeah.
I completely agree. It's a fact of life. But then there's a whole load of shade of grey from there out towards interfering in elections in a very targeted and deliberate way. Where do you think the line is? And the courts will decide that from a strict legal perspective, but as somebody working in the organisation, at what point do you think the line got crossed and you felt this is not okay?
Yeah. Thanks. Just before, hold that thought.
Yeah.
And then we'll get
Okay. I was recently at a talk by Niall Ferguson who said there are two kinds of politicians now in the world: those who understand how Facebook advertising works and those who lose. But how measurable is the impact of that advertising? Is it possible actually to say, okay, well, it has it gets 1% more people out to vote and to vote in this direction if you do your targeted ads in this way? How measurable is it?
Cool.
So where do you draw the line between targeted advertising and interfering with elections, and how measurable is the impact of this sort of information?
So I'll start with that question because it's the easiest to answer. You can measure it through controlled trials. So when I was at CA and other projects that I've worked at, you can measure it through both controlled trials online and then also like randomized field experiments to see what the likely effect is. I mean,
Can you give an example that sort of illustrates?
So, I mean, quite simply, you can look at treatment effects against a control, and it does have an impact. The problem when you're dealing with any kind of like social or any sort of research to do with sort of social interaction or humans in general, you've got so many confounding factors that it is difficult to purely isolate in the same way that you can in like a lab. But that's the brilliance about like machine learning, is that you can take lots of messy information and lots of confounding factors and still start to weed out impact. But I've seen programs where you create uplift of 10%. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you have a targeted group of people where that 10% translates into that 1% difference, you've won. And the thing about elections is it's one of the few examples of a purely zero-sum game, right? You win one more vote and you win 100% and they will lose 100%. And then the next question.
Drawing a line between targeting and interfering with elections.
Right. So I kind of think about it like dating, because so if you think about it like, okay, so would you go on a blind date where the person that you're going out on a date with knows everything about you? You've read like a full psychological report, knows everything about you, knows what grades you got in primary school, knows who you talk to, your guilty pleasures, whatever, right? And you don't know anything about them. That kind of would, I don't know, I wouldn't want to go on that date, but maybe, I don't know, some people are more adventurous. But the reason why that's uncomfortable is because you can't understand the motives of that person when they say, oh, I like this music in this exact sequential order. And you go, huh, that's exactly my playlist. I wonder, are we a perfect match, or are you just saying that? And so, but with online advertising, oftentimes it's like slightly worse than that, because it's like you are going on that blind date, but you don't even know that that person knows everything about you. And then there's questions, if you think about it through the analogy of a date, there's questions about consent, and is that person, genuinely understanding of that situation? In contracts or commercial terms, you talk about fraud. Is this misleading? And so I think when you ask, where do you draw the line? There's no clear answer, but I think you start with transparency, and you start with ensuring that the person is aware, at least, of the situation. You are being targeted. We know the following things about you, and we are presenting this information because we think you'll like it. In the same way that if your blind date then discloses, oh, I said that playlist because I just know you like it, well, then all of a sudden that changes the dynamic of the date. You might not go on a second one.
You might think this is the person for me.
Or you might go, you know what, I love somebody who memorizes my playlist. Yeah, this might be a thing.
So I've got two questions down the front there. If you can just keep them nice and sharp, then we can get
thank you
through.
for the insights. I just wanted to add something and ask you if you agree with Gerald Lanier. In his book, he writes about 10 reasons why to delete all the social media.
Oh, I have
it's
that
one of
literally
these
in my bag.
Yeah, in mine too. And he said it's enough to spread negativity, so you can manipulate emotionally the people. So if you spread negativity, so people become more anxious, and this is exactly that vote or that 1% that you need to win the election. Because when people are anxious and negative and see the word negative, they are voting more conservative, actually.
Thank you.
What do you think?
Okay, hold that, and we'll go to we're just trying to get through as many
Hi,
questions.
Christopher. There's a Facebook television advert running at the moment in the UK, which is clearly a response to some of the events of the last year.
It's in Washington. I was just in Washington, D.C. It's all over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Has anything changed at Facebook, or just the advertising?
I don't know. I mean, like, they won't talk to me. I'm still banned. I'm still banned. Not just on Facebook, on Instagram, too. I miss my curated pictures of avocado toast in the morning. I haven't seen anything. Some of the changes that Facebook has been doing, I think, actually are like even more problematic. Like the fact that they're creating an even more restrictive platform, where, for example, third-party data vendors no longer can participate in their targeting, just creates a consolidation of their market dominance. Where in this sort of weird way, through the lens of privacy, they're creating a situation where no one will eventually be able to compete with Facebook because it's the sort of universe's database of record, which in a way actually creates more potential for problems later on, not just from a market competition perspective, but from the fact that they have all this information and no one else does. And then also when you look at some of the really knee-jerk reactions, like the ability to delete your messages after you've sent them, after people realize that Facebook executives got that and people are demanding it for everybody. I mean, that potentially creates a situation where if you are a domestic abuser, or if you're a bully, or what have you, you're able to do it and there's no trace of it because you can just delete it after the fact. So I think a lot of the things, they're sort of scratching around the surface without kind of really asking a really tough question, which is like, are we an online community or are we just a harvester of data? You know, they always talk about this community of users, but they don't really seem to engage users as a community itself.
And the manipulation of emotions, and,
Yeah,
and that was sort of one of the Aaron Banks type of thing about the referendum here being about emotion and not reason.
Yeah, yeah. So people, so there's something called identity-motivated reasoning, and everybody has it. It is just a fact of being human. You like information that is sort of reinforcing of your own self-concept. People react also to information more forcefully if it's negative. There's a lot of research on that. And again, it's what I was saying before, you know, what's interesting to the public isn't always in the public interest. And so the problem, and this is kind of exactly why I think that we do need standards for safety, because right now it is totally legal to make people as neurotic as possible to buy your product. That's allowed. You can do that, right? And so you know, the question is should we allow that kind of messaging? Should we allow a company to decide that we are going to create a more negative life experience for this group of people so that we can monetize them in some way, right? I mean, should that be allowed? And so, you can't rely on the good nature of Facebook or others to enforce that, because frankly, they make a lot of money on it, because that's what optimizes ads, you know, the most. And so there's a perverse incentive there if you are Facebook or other platforms. So, and I think that's why we need oversight.
I've got another question.
So I'm just thinking about other things that might tie into this. In environmental sustainability, it took over a decade of studies and journals and books to finally get the message across that pollution and waste is bad, and we need to take action, and finally motivated society to demand change and to motivate companies to make positive environmental changes.
You still have a lot of acquiescence, though.
I'm saying, you know, it sounds like this is going to require the same amount of publicity in order to get any action really going, because it feels like we'd need more stories and more outcry about it really reaching the headlines.
And to make it more tangible. I
So
mean,
that
that's one of the
people-
problems with it. It's interesting that you compare it to environmental sustainability, because they're both sort of innately abstract. It's hard to always see the exact tangible outcome on you specifically when it comes to climate change or when it comes to data protection. Oh, am I supposed to? Sorry, we're doing two at a time.
No,
Sorry.
that's, I think that's,
Yeah.
there's a lady there in the middle towards the back.
So I'd like to ask you about, well, you've talked about the pressure on whistleblowers.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you about regulators.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me we had a big problem with the ICO in relation to Cambridge Analytica, and also the Electoral Commission in relation to leave.eu and Vote Leave.
Yeah.
They had all the information on their database, but it took legal proceedings for them to actually start an investigation. And indeed, the evidence produced by Carol Cadwallader and the Spotlight program yesterday, for example, I mean, that's information you'd
I was in that.
Yeah, you were. But you'd expect a regulator to have done the work that the journalists did. So I want to ask you about regulators being under political pressure, under pressure from the media, and how can we basically make them braver?
Do you want to have a quick one on that, and then we're going to go down to this chap?
Well, I mean, when you are the Electoral Commission or the ICO, you don't actually have a huge amount of powers at your disposal. You also don't have huge budgets. And so, you know, for things like data protection or something super fundamental, the electoral law, which sounds like some kind of abstract thing that, you know, sits in a library somewhere, but it's the law that makes sure that our democracy is fundamentally fair and legal. And we've got these bizarre rules with the Electoral Commission where it, like, it's really difficult to compel evidence. There's all these weird statute of limitations where it's like after a year you can't prosecute, so as long as you're not discovered in that amount of time, you're good to go. Like, and the fines. I mean, the ridiculous thing. Okay, this is our democracy we're talking about, right? And so when a big fine is like £10,000, right? It encourages you to go and funnel money in all kinds of places, and because fine, you get fined after the fact. Well, you've already won. And so what? It's a cost of doing business. You'll just get a funder to pay for it, right? There's. Yeah.
I've actually got somebody. I've got somebody waiting to ask a question. So very quickly.
The Electoral Commission has massive investigatory powers, and my concern is that actually it's a much more scary and dangerous environment if you're actually confronting people who are potentially in the cabinet. It's actually quite a scary thing to investigate that and take that on.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, I just wanted to pick up something you mentioned earlier around the code of ethics or the lack of code of ethics for software engineers and data scientists. Obviously, you're absolutely right. A lot of industries, medicine, engineering, all that has got that. But I think what we're lacking is a real profession in the industry. Yeah. But I wonder what your thoughts are of what the impact of having that in the industry would be. In that, you know, if I want to be an engineer, I've got to jump through a whole host of tests and academia and professional things. But to be a software engineer, I just need to convince someone in the interview that I can put a bit of code together. So what do you think the impact in both the industry and specifically innovation in the industry would be to have the real profession and code of ethics and all that?
So I really like that question. I'm self-taught. I didn't do engineering. I just really like coding because I'm a massive nerd. And you just show people like a portfolio on GitHub or whatever, and if it's really cool, then you can get hired. I think that's great. Code of ethics wouldn't stop you from doing that. It just would require you to conform to a statutory code of ethical practice. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go and jump through lots of hoops or get lots of tests, because that doesn't have to do with qualifications. It just has to do with your behavior as a coder, as an engineer, as a data scientist. So, I agree. One of the most amazing things about the tech sector is that it doesn't have hang-ups like every other sector does on these pieces of paper, right? You know, you have a degree in whatever, or what, you know, it doesn't, it's like if you're good at what you do, you can go and do it. And I think that's great, but do it ethically and make sure that you are giving due consideration to the social impact of your work. But that wouldn't necessarily, I don't think that would inhibit people like me, actually, from working as an engineer or as a data scientist, because it just means that there is a code that you have to join that means that when you build shit, it has to be like cool for society, not evil.
Right, we're out of time now, I'm afraid. I've just got one last question for you, Christopher, and thank you very much for everything that you've said and for coming here today. Reflecting on the last crazy couple of years, do you think that coming forward was worth it? Do you think that it's really cut through to the people who were most vulnerable to being manipulated? And is there anything you'd do differently?
Okay, so I really like the fact that we're now having this conversation. Can you imagine this time last year if you said, like, one of the main issues of 2008 is going to be data protection? People would be like, really? But it's really important, and it's important because, as we were talking about before, when it's not just now, it's like what happens in 10 years' time when you've got algorithms running everything. Yeah. That's where it becomes really, really, really important. And I'm optimistic that conversation has started. I'm optimistic by the fact that I've now sat down, I think, with 30 plus members of Congress in the States, MEPs in the EU, MPs here, and having a space to ask questions like, well, what is the internet? What's an algorithm? I don't even know what that is. Like, tell me about it. I'm like, okay, let me draw it out. Let's have that conversation. And that legislators and regulators are starting to wake up to the fact that this is important. I really like, and I've literally seen it because I've been working with data protection authorities since before all of this came out. And there's this, I've seen a discernible culture change in the past couple of months, where before you had a lot of regulators who kind of were a bit timid in dealing with these big multinational companies. It would often be sort of seeking out compromise and figuring out a way to eventually create compliance at some point in time. Now you've got all these like data protection authorities who are like, the cop on the beat, right?
They've even got jackets.
Yeah, they've even got jackets, which is super cool. And that people are starting to understand data crimes are real crimes. And I think that, and for me, that's really promising. The thing that I would say though is that I am an exception to the rule in being a whistleblower. Where I've come through it, and I didn't end up, completely destitute or in prison in Guantanamo or what have you, or sectioned, whatever. So the thing that I would just highlight is that I am not the norm. There are a lot of us, and I've met a lot of them, who have the most horrific experience. They don't get the same kind of attention and end up, really paying the price for doing something good for the rest of their lives. And so something to just keep in mind is that the sort of notion of a Herculean, heroic whistleblower is false. That's not the norm. It's what you see, but it's not the norm.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christopher
Cheers.
Wylie.